Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started now. Hi. Good to see so many familiar faces here. My name is Amy Harris. I'm the director of the Museum of Natural History, and I'm delighted to have you all here this evening. This is the first event in a series over the next several days. We're going to be dedicating this building, the Biological Sciences Building, and also dedicating the new Museum of Natural History. And as you'll learn as I tell you a little bit about this building, it's a space that was designed for collaboration. So this lecture, for example, is a collaboration between the Museum of Natural History and the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. The building was designed with a very open floor plan for the labs so that scientists can collaborate more readily. And the new Museum of Natural History winds through the building so that our visitors can look into active research labs and maybe run into a scientist in the cafe and have a conversation. There are opportunities for collaboration with the museum as well for the researchers in our new Science Forum space, which is a small theater-like space where scientists of every level can give presentations to the public, and we will provide training for that. So even undergraduates will be involved in that activity. We also plan to have collaborations between researchers and the public. In the future, we'll be really fostering and encouraging citizen science projects where members of the public can contribute to the research that's going on. The University of Michigan is one of the leading research universities in the world, and this building and this museum provide really unprecedented access to research for the public. And in the museum, we'll be offering opportunities to see research and science in action instead of the kind of finished-looking science that you might see in some of the older style museums. Some other examples of that are we'll have changing exhibits of faculty research and some public labs, we call them investigate labs, and those two features will open a little bit later. Let's see. So the museum's grand opening is coming up this Sunday. We'll have extended hours. We're starting with a ribbon cutting at 8:45 in the morning for early risers. And then we'll be open from 9 a.m. until 8 p.m. And we really hope that you'll come out. If you're not an early riser and if you don't have a taste for a big public event like that, we'll be open 7 days a week after that. So you can come at your leisure. Our hours will be 9 to 5 every day, except for Thursdays when we'll be open until 8. So you can come in the evening after work if you want. Between now and then, we have a series of additional events to thank our members and donors of the museum. And I just happened to put some brochures in the back in case anyone's interested in becoming a member. So we hope you'll visit the museum, come back often, and then also make sure you come back in November when we'll be opening some additional exhibits. And with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Diarmuid Ó Foill. He is the chair of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome, everybody, especially those of you this is your first time in the building. As Amy said, this building is meant to serve many functions. In terms of its scientific mission, we cover the entire breadth of biology, from molecular details of cell function to the evolution of the whole Earth's biota, its evolutionary history. We also are deeply engaged in education. This is one of our active learning classrooms. And thanks to the Museum of Natural History, we're engaged in public outreach, public education. So our distinguished speaker tonight, Sean Carroll, he's a distinguished scientist and a distinguished science educator. I'd like to thank our graduate students who nominated him as their choice for departmental speaker, and also Sean for his willingness and eagerness actually to give a public talk tonight. And if we were to pick somebody who epitomizes the breadth of research that happens in this building and the breadth of science education, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find somebody other than Sean. He's a remarkably well-known scientist. He's helped found an entire new field within biology, the evolution of development, or Evo-Devo for short. We know since Darwin that, in theory, we all share a common ancestor, and all of the diversity of life we see around us are variations on inherited developmental themes from that ancestor. But we knew until very recently, until a few decades ago at the very most, how those developmental pathways evolved. What were their groundworks and controls? And thanks to Sean, and also thanks to many of the people he's trained dozens of leading researchers in this field, we now know a lot about the evolution of development, especially for multicellular animals. Among his many contributions are the insight that the diversity of body forms we see around us, say between us and fruit flies, are not due to differences in genomes. We share substantially the same genes, but they're mainly due to the regulation of those genes. Okay, and which is a rather profound insight. He's won oodles of awards. I'm not going to bother naming them all, except to say he's a member of some of the leading organizations of science, including the National Academy of Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. In addition, he has a parallel career in science education, and not just in the classroom. We saw today at his noontime lecture for our department what a great lecturer on science he is, and his research. Also, he's very interested and very effective at outreach to the public in science, a very important aspect of our overall function. Just to give you a brief summary, for many years he had a very influential column in the New York Times. He's written oodles of books on science and biology, which are very well received. He's also involved in video and filmmaking of an educational nature. He's the vice president of HHMI's Department of Science Education, and leads its film production unit, Tangle Bank Studios. Now, his most recent book is titled The Serengeti Rules. If you haven't read it, go out and get it. It's a great read. The quest to discover how life works and why it matters. And the title of his presentation tonight is a variation of that, Serengeti Rules, the Regulation and Restoration of Biodiversity. Please join me in welcoming Sean.
Thanks, Dermot. Thanks, Ann. Thanks, Ann Arbor. Thanks especially to the EEB students who organized all my day and my travel here, and for telling me all your stories. I'm only got one more left in me, and it's the Serengeti Rules tonight. Just also say I'm kind of amongst my people because I grew up 50 miles down the road in Toledo, Ohio. As Dermot mentioned, there was a war between Michigan and Ohio, and Michigan won, and so Ohio got Toledo. So, boom, boom. Okay, so a few years ago, as Dermot mentioned, I work on films, and I was working on a film for the Smithsonian Channel with the cheery title, Mass Extinction. And we were looking back into the past to some of the mass extinctions deep in time to sort of understand even changes that are taking place today. And for me, an indoor biologist, it was my first chance really to spend a fair amount of time with ecologists. The truth is, a lot in biology is that various disciplines are separated from each other. Fortunately, not in this building, not in this campus. And when I went to various places around the world with those ecologists, I started to understand some of the warning signs that they were seeing, even in things as protected as Yellowstone National Park. And like you, I read headlines like this about what's happened to the populations of the world's wildlife over the last half century or so. And then headlines like this out of the Serengeti, where there was contemplation of putting a highway right through the wildebeest migration route. And ever since I was a little kid in Toledo, Ohio, watching the show Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom in black and white, okay, I dreamed of going to places like the Serengeti, and somehow I had gone through most of my biology career without getting there. And so I decided in 2014 that I should go there, and I was concerned enough that I thought that I should bring my family. So this is my gang. My son Chris on the left, daughter-in-law Kristen, myself, my wife Jamie, my son Will, my son Patrick. And I'm about to commit the greatest sin you can ever do with a room full of strangers, and I'm going to show you home video and pictures for a few minutes from a trip through Serengeti. But the thought was that we should see this before it changes. So there we are in the very fancily marked east entrance gate to Serengeti. No Motel 6s or McDonald's around. This is our view as we're about to go through that gate from the top of the vehicle. And so we got the vehicle up. I got a little Paul Simon's Graceland running through my mind. And we're rolling in to go see, one of the greatest wildlife wildernesses in the world. And as we are rolling on, this is late June. You can see the grass is a little bit brown. We're on a gravel road. And it takes a while, but finally somebody calls out and sees the top of this lioness. Okay. Okay, that's great, but I got to tell you that if this is what wildlife spotting in the Serengeti was going to be like, I realized I'm the only biologist in my family, and I think they were just going to put me outside the car and drive back away to the lodge. This was going to be really hard, seeing some things. But we kept driving. We started seeing little splashes of green. I could even see a little shimmer of water. We kind of came up over a rise, and as we came up through the Serengeti, I started seeing really stripes all around, 360 degrees. Must have been about 2,000 zebra that were at this water hole. And then coming down from the west towards this water hole, you see there's the dawn patrol. And from that moment on, the Serengeti offered up an unending canvas of animals of all sizes and shapes and colors, from sturdy warthogs to lounging hippos, which is what they're really good at, sleek gazelles, and majestic giraffes. These are actually pictures I gathered from my family, not professional photos, okay? The giraffes, I think my wife and I decided these are our favorite animals, so we stopped for every giraffe. That was a lot of stops, I'm happy to tell you. Spent a private morning with this one as she dashed up and down this tree, feeding on a freshly caught gazelle. She would come down, get a little drink, go back up, eat a little more gazelle. And I agree, that's the best way to eat raw gazelle. But as I sort of looked across this wilderness, I was awestruck. Nothing I had ever seen on TV, nothing I'd ever read about spoiled that impression. I was just dumbfounded. The numbers of wildlife was so amazing. And as you can see, as you look across the terrain like this, because of the way the acacias, for example, grow, your visibility, for hundreds of yards, you can see animals because they're exposed. It's the easiest viewing of any place I've seen, and the numbers of animals was just amazing. We could see, wildebeest, for example, in large numbers. But as the days went on in the Serengeti, sort of an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. And that was, the spectacle was great, but I didn't understand a thing about what I was looking at. I'm a professional biologist, theoretically, but I've been paid to be in a lab. And if questions came from in the car of, hey, Dad, what about nothing? Nothing. I've been an indoor molecular biologist. I had no idea how this whole spectacle was unfolding in front of us. I didn't know why there were, for example, so many wildebeest, but so few topi, a grazer of really similar size. And that is embarrassing because I'm a professional biologist. Also embarrassing because I've studied animals and animal diversity my whole life. Now, granted, less kind of charismatic animals like fruit flies, but I do know something about these animals. And what I know is that inside every one of these animals, inside every cell in those animals, just like inside you and me, there's things going on. Everything is regulated. The numbers of everything inside these animals are regulated. And so as I looked across the landscape of the Serengeti, I started to wonder, was that also true of larger things? So let me tell you what we know about regulation and give you some sense about what's going on in your bodies as you digest your meal. Lobster mac and cheese for me tonight, by the way. Thank you, University of Michigan. So what I mean by everything is regulated is that in our bodies, the concentration of every substance, every salt, every fat, every hormone, everything, is maintained in a particular range. Some things are present in very, very tiny amounts. Some things in very large amounts. And when it comes out of that range, generally we detect that as some kind of disease and want to do something about it. By the same token, in all of our organs, all of our tissues, the number of cells is regulated. White cells, red cells, gut cells, kidney cells, etc. And when the number of cells in any particular tissue goes out of whack, like too few red cells, that's anemia, too many white cells, that's leukemia, well, that's disease. And really, it's been the project of biology for the last 50 years to understand how things within our body are regulated. And if you allow me, in Ann Arbor, a little bit of a sports analogy, let me tell you the general strategy. To understand how life works, we need to know the rules of regulation. And that's generally been identifying the key players, in this case, in our bodies, the molecules that regulate a given process. And then we figure out the rules that govern their play. And then in the cases of disease, we figure out how we can do something about it. And this is exactly what molecular biology, my tribe of biologists, have been doing for the last 50 years. And it truly has sparked a revolution in medicine. So with that knowledge is power when you understand the rules of regulation. And so, for example, a major strategy of medicine is to figure out if a player is missing or if some link has been broken between various players, is to try to restore those links or restore those missing players. Give you a couple drugs that are familiar and used by millions of people across the world. On the left is insulin for, of course, the control of blood sugar. This is genetically engineered insulin. On the right is Lipitor, one of many so-called statin drugs that exploits detailed knowledge of how cholesterol levels are regulated in the human body to lower the so-called bad cholesterol. So medicine has made huge progress by understanding the rules of regulation. I know that all the events in a fruit fly's body are regulated. I know that all these things in our body are regulated. I'm wondering whether out on that landscape are the numbers of other things regulated. And so when I got back from the Serengeti, I started reading up on really what I discovered to be biology I had missed while I was napping or doing something else the last few decades. So how are the numbers of animals and plants regulated? Are they regulated? Well, are there rules that govern life at larger scales? The answer is yes, otherwise talk is over, which may be the best news you could have gotten here. And I wrote about these in a recent book that Darren mentioned called the Serengeti Rules. And I named them the Serengeti Rules pretty much because you can see them all on display in the Serengeti, but they really work everywhere. I could have called them the Lake Erie Rules, but the publisher said, nah. But the reason to learn about these rules, and it's really the reason I'm giving you this talk tonight and the angle I'm going to give you in this talk, is to give you some hope. I hope you walk out of here in 45 minutes from now feeling better than when you came in. Because really, the journey I went on starting in 2014, it started in the Serengeti and it ended in another country in southern Africa, was I wanted to ask the question as I went around the world, can we do something about the state of wilderness, about wildlife and wild places? Is there still time? Is there still hope? And so in the last part of my talk, I want to talk about, can we use these rules to preserve or even cure ailing ecosystems? Okay, so we're going to go out on the Serengeti first, and I thought before I do that, I should give you a little history about the place. The Serengeti was not well known for maybe really the first half of the 20th century. Not many people visited. First of all, the world was tied up in a couple world wars. Second of all, it was really difficult to gain access to it. But in the 1950s, people started getting to the Serengeti, and some of those first people were, lo and behold, biologists. And when they confronted the same scene that I did, which was massive numbers of animals, they did what biologists do, which is they started to count them. Okay? So the first thing you got to figure out in the Serengeti is what's here. And the first counts were undertaken in 1958 by two German naturalists, Michael and Bernard Gzimek, father and son team. And I'm going to show you a little clip from a movie they made that actually won the Oscar for Best Documentary in 1959 that shows you how they count the animals on the Serengeti. So, okay? So here we go. So here they are plotting their course on their clipboards, Michael and Bernard right there. And they're going to get into their very Natalie painted plane. There you go. Camouflage so no animals notice it. Climb in with a couple other spotters with their clipboards. And I'll show you here the strategy that they're going to use. This is computer graphics circa 1959. They're going to fly in a grid pattern across sectors of the Serengeti. Here we go, back and forth, back and forth. And they're going to count all the animals they can see from the air. So you ready to get started? Here we go. Join in. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Yes. This is flying low and slow over the Serengeti, counting the wildlife on a clipboard. Okay? You might notice the animals are moving. They have to go, they have to go about 120 miles an hour, but they're counting everything that's large enough to see from the air. And from those counts, they came up with some pretty rather astonishing figures, okay, and won an Oscar. So this is their survey, January 1958, the first systematic count of wildlife in the Serengeti. And they counted 99,481 wildebeest, not 480, not 482, okay? Some of the skeptics in the audience, who may be chuckling at this moment, of course, are realizing this took almost 2 weeks to do, and the animals might not have been in the same place the next day when they flew over them. But nonetheless, they also reported 57,199 zebra, and with Teutonic precision, 5,172 topi, 1,800 or so buffalo, only about 60 elephants, but altogether, almost 367,000 large mammals. And they were dumbstruck. They were also worried. And they wrote, were there enough plains, mountains, river valleys, and bush areas to maintain the last giant herds still in existence? Could the Serengeti even support what they were seeing? Well, within a few years, they were going to get an answer to their question. But it wasn't the answer they expected or the one that they feared. And that answer started to materialize once a young Oxford undergraduate arrived in the Serengeti in 1965 named Tony Sinclair, who went there ostensibly to study the birds. Tony had heard of the Serengeti. He followed a professor down there from Oxford. And when he arrived, right away they put him on the aerial counts of wildlife. And when he arrived, in that first counting season, he discovered that something was going on with the buffalo. That whereas in 1961 they had counted 16,000 buffalo, 4 years later, Tony's gang counted 37,000 buffalo. So it seemed like the number of buffalo were increasing. At the end of the summer, a magical summer for Tony, he decided he wanted to come back to the Serengeti to get his PhD. And they said, well, Tony, would you like to study buffalo? Can a birdman study buffalo? And he said, I'll study anything. And that's how Tony became the world's first expert on African buffalo. And over about the next dozen years or so, Tony spent most of his research life in the Serengeti, first doing his work for a PhD and beyond, understanding the habits of the buffalo and figuring out whether or not there was something going on with the buffalo that he should understand. This is a tranquilized buffalo, just to point out to all of you. He's being a little bit careful. So what Tony wanted to understand was, why were the buffalo increasing? He wanted to understand what explained the great differences in the numbers of different kinds of animals in the Serengeti. And really, in his soul, he wanted to understand, why is the Serengeti the way it is? Which to some degree is exactly what I wanted to know once I visited there. And so for the next dozen years, he did work on the buffalo and some other species that I'm going to describe. The first thing he asked was, well, was his result regarding the buffalo even accurate? Did the trend, was it maintained? And in fact, he was able to confirm that the buffalo population was growing. So by 1972, it had almost quadrupled from 1961 to 58,000 animals. So this was a mystery, and he decided this was the mystery he was going to try to earn his PhD on. And he wanted to ask the question, why were the buffalo increasing? So this is the audience, one of the audience participation parts of this show. And there's some kids here in the audience, so we're going to give them special opportunity if they have the courage to put it up. But tell me, anyone without a PhD in ecology, why might the buffalo be increasing in the Serengeti? Shout it out. Predators, I heard. Fewer predators? Lack of predators. Good guess. Any other thoughts? Why might you have more buffalo? Say again?
Fleeing the growth of population around the Serengeti.
Fleeing the growth of population. You say that's immigration coming in from somewhere. The buffalo were coming from somewhere else.
Yes.
Okay. Any other guesses? Hypotheses? Yeah. Less competition for food? Yeah.
Maybe more food.
Maybe more food? Look it up. More grasslands, which would be more, do you know what the buffalo eat? More food, yeah. All right, here we go. Oh, wait, we got pointy, it's right here. Go ahead, an arm up. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, what you got? More time on? I still can't hear the last word. Their migration. Okay, so the buffalo here aren't migrating, but it's a good idea. Keep that in mind, okay? The spotlight's coming back to you in a little while, okay? Because you're a step ahead of everybody in this room, okay? All right, so we got a couple hypotheses there. I can't make the slides up on the go, so we're going to do them in an order that I decided ahead of time, okay? So, how about more food along the more grasslands idea? Well, from all these aerial surveys, they could look and they knew rainfall, et cetera, and they could measure the amount of grassland available and the amount of forage available for the buffalo. And it turns out, no, the amount of food wasn't going up over that 15 years. It seemed to be the same amount of grassland, same level of growth, pretty consistent rainfall. So what about the predator question, right? If there's more food, if there's not more food, what about maybe there's fewer predators or no predators? So Tony actually carefully studied the causes of death of these buffalo. So a couple of observations. First of all, not the major cause of death of buffalo. So some buffalo will be taken by lions, but it's not the major cause of death. Secondly, other biologists were studying predator populations, like lions in the Serengeti. They were actually going up. So are there fewer predators? No. Now, no one's brought up another possibility. So we're going to open the floor again. So if you think you've got more buffalo and they've got just as much food, and if not more predators, you might think, what would perhaps either increase their birth rate or decrease their death rate? Fire away, right there. I wish there was a prize for that one. You said, did you all hear wild amounts of intercourse? I'll let the parents deal with that. First time I've gotten that answer, but please see me afterwards. There is room for you in the Hall of Fame of biology. Yeah. Less disease? Less disease. But I do like that answer, I got to tell you. I think Tony would have noticed. And actually, with more buffalo, there would be more. So technically, you're right, but not an unusually amount more that I'm aware of. Disease. And maybe there was less disease in the Serengeti. And Tony thought about all the diseases that he knew that buffalo got, and there was one that was actually infamous in the Serengeti. And it's called cattle plague or rinderpest. And it was known since about 1890 that every few years there would be an absolutely devastating outbreak of rinderpest that would hit, and it's important, I mentioned the species, it would hit the domesticated cattle of the grazing populations around the nomadic tribes as well as the ranches around the Serengeti, and it also hit buffalo and it hit wildebeest. Okay, so he thought, maybe rinderpest is disappearing. The reason why it was thought that wildlife were the reservoir for this disease, but he knew that right around 1960, a new vaccine had been invented, and there was a rinderpest vaccination program going on in the domesticated herds within and around the Serengeti. And he thought, well, maybe that has something to do with it. He thought, well, how am I going to test this? So the way he tested that is buffalo, just like you and I, if they're exposed to a virus, their immune system will make antibodies to that virus. So by looking at blood samples from buffalo, you can see whether or not those buffalo have been exposed to the virus. And if you know the age of buffalo, which you can tell from their teeth, you can figure out whether, for example, younger buffalo have not been exposed to a virus, whereas maybe older buffalo that have been on the Serengeti longer have been exposed. And so Tony looked at the exposure of the buffalo to the virus, and he got his first eureka moment. Because while there was a high level of exposure in older buffalo born since 1963 showed no exposure to the rinderpest virus. And it's really a double eureka because the vaccination program only involved cattle. It turns out that the cattle were carriers, and that by vaccinating the cattle, you got a spillover benefit to the buffalo. So remember I told you there was another species that was affected by the virus? What was that? Wildebeest. You're all paying attention? Thank you. So Tony thought to just see whether or not this was, in fact, what was going on. He started paying closer attention to the wildebeest. So even though the 1970s were rocky in Tanzania politically, at some effort and a little bit of danger, he carried out counts on the wildebeest. And let me show you the numbers of wildebeest counted up through 1977. I love an audience that reacts to this. 1.4 million wildebeest in 1977. Now remember, the Grzimiks were worried that the Serengeti couldn't hold 360,000 animals. The wildebeest had boomed to 1.4 million. And they had boomed, Tony suspected, because rinderpest was gone. And so he did the same experiment in the wildebeest. He looked at exposure to the virus in their bloodstream, age matched that with samples, and said, oh, look at this. The wildebeest shown here, none of the wildebeest born since about 63 show any exposure to the virus. So the vaccination program against a virus that came in with domesticated cattle in about 1890 into East Africa from India, once vaccinating against that, the buffalo and the wildebeest took off. Now, parallel to this, Tony and other biologists working in the Serengeti noticed other changes taking place in the Serengeti over this time. And I'm going to just mention a few of these changes, and then we'll see whether or not we can kind of connect them in any kind of cause and effect way. So one of the annual events in the Serengeti is fire, which burns up some of the dry vegetation. And if you look at the degree of burning in the park over these years, you see that between 62 and 72, there was a lot less burning, fewer fires, and they were less intense. So a dramatic decrease all across the park in the amount of what was burning. Counts of other animals showed changes in other populations. So I'll just give you one data point. In the early 70s, boom in giraffe populations. Who doesn't like more giraffes, right? One more data point. Tony actually thought, especially elephants were kind of coming back in the Serengeti, Tony thought that the trees in the Serengeti were on their way out. So what he did was he started taking pictures from the same vantage point in the Serengeti over a period of years. Let me show you what he observed. Unfortunately, he took the first one on a cloudy day. But from this vantage point, from the tallest rock he could find overlooking the Serengeti, kind of one of those Lion King kind of places, you could see the smattering of acacia trees here that he could view in 1980. But he could see by 86 there were actually more young seedlings. Hard for you to see, but you can see it. This area starts to fill in so that decades later, this is a full acacia forest. So the trees weren't actually disappearing from the Serengeti. They were roaring back. They were expanding. The forest cover was expanding. So now let's see whether we can put some of these observations together. So the vaccine knocks out this virus that was introduced through cattle, and you get more grazers, right? And what do those grazers eat? Grass. Okay. Well, what do you think the eating of that grass is going to do to, say, the frequency of fires? Decrease those level of fires. You get shorter grass. So they actually mow the grass down. There's less grass, and it's all shorter. So you get fewer fires. And what do you think fires have in terms of influence on, say, young trees? Right. Fewer fires, more trees, right? And what do those more trees provide? More food for giraffes, exactly. And more nesting sites for birds, more cover for predators. And that shorter grass turns out to be better habitat for things like butterflies. More buffalo, more wildebeest, more giraffes, more trees, more butterflies, more. So Tony, if you asked him today, what makes the Serengeti the way it is? Well, what do you say? Well, back to where's my friend here? It's hidden from my view. Those 1.4 million wildebeests, what do? They migrate, that's right. They make about a 600-mile circuit around the Serengeti in the course of a year, and they munch that grass, right? So Tony realized those 1.4 million wildebeests were having a big effect on munching that grass down. So if you asked them, why is the Serengeti the way it is? It's because of 1 million lawnmowers mowing all that grass. So migration is the key there, right? So this animal, not the charismatic animal, I mean, tell me, if you watch a documentary on the African savannah, it's going to be about first 90 seconds, you're going to see a cat chase a gazelle, right? And you think that's what makes the Serengeti the way it is. It's the wildebeest. This not so charismatic animal, but in its large numbers and through its migration, sculpts this landscape, this mundane act of just munching grass, sculpts this landscape which shapes the habitat for so many other creatures. So overlooked, in fact, that when I asked my family for pictures of wildebeest, it was difficult to come up with any, despite the fact that they were in every direction that we ever looked. Got the zebras, got the giraffes, got everything else. This is a picture from Tony of the massing of the wildebeest that happens early in the winter. So this brings me to my first Serengeti rule. Took a while. There's only going to be 4. We're going to get through them a little faster. And that is that some animals are more equal than others. In this case, it's the wildebeest that plays a disproportionate effect on community diversity. And ecologists have come up with a name for species like this called Keystone species. And the name comes from a very famous University of Michigan alum named Bob Payne, who discovered this not on the Serengeti, but discovered it in the rocky intertidal zone of the Pacific Northwest, studying this creature, these starfish. And Bob discovered that when these starfish were removed from this intertidal zone, the whole community collapsed. And he thought it was just like the Keystone in a Roman arch in this animation that I stole off the web that I can't possibly slow down. But the idea was that just like the Keystone in a Roman arch, where its removal causes the arch to collapse, Bob discovered that when this species was removed, community diversity collapsed. And we understand from the role of the wildebeest that when it was in lower numbers, the Serengeti was a really different place. And when those numbers came back, the Serengeti boomed. So that's a keystone species. Bob also came up with a term to describe this sort of chain reaction working its way through the food chain of the influence of various species on another, sort of the strong indirect effects of one species on another, how the grazers affect fire and trees and giraffes, et cetera. And he called this a trophic cascade. Trophic refers to feeding, these cascading effects. And that's already our second Serengeti rule, where it's halftime almost in the ball game, okay? And that Serengeti rule is that some species have strong indirect effects on other species through trophic cascades. The first cascades were not discovered in the Serengeti. It's just some place where you can see it on display. So keystone species and trophic cascades, 2 really key Serengeti rules, that some species have a disproportionate effect on the diversity in a system. Now, we were talking about the big numbers of animals, and you may start to be thinking, well, if 1977 there were 1.4 million wildebeest, what happened since then? You can imagine if the wildebeest went on multiplying, that all of East Africa would be buried in wildebeest. But that's not what happened, and it's important to understand what happened and why to get to our last couple Serengeti rules. So it turns out 1977 was the peak year, and that over subsequent years, the number of wildebeest sort of worked its way down. So it's been pretty stable for a while, around about 1 million animals. Okay? So Tony wanted to understand, well, what regulates the wildebeest? Why didn't the wildebeest become even more numerous, and how are they sort of oscillating around this about a 1 million population? And to get at that, we just kind of think about what I walked through. What could regulate the number of wildebeest, right? Well, if you think about a food chain, an animal, here's a grazer. It's grazing on food, and in turn, predators feed on it. So really, you can sort of think that the number of animals is either regulated from what ecologists would say in shorthand, from the bottom up by the availability of food, or from the top down by the number of predators. And before I tell you how the wildebeest are regulated, I want to give you a little picture into how other mammals of the Serengeti are regulated, because this is really going to give you some feel for how the place works. So just as I walk through for the wildebeest, those same possibilities exist for any other mammal. So Serengeti mammals are regulated either by predation, right, or by the level of food, and of course disease and things like that. But really, in the food chain, it's really whether the amount of food is controlling them, or the amount of predators, the amount of predation that's controlling them. And to figure that out, I can't point at this graph to the 3 sectors of audience that are here. So hopefully I'll do the middle one, and maybe we'll follow this through. This is one of my favorite little graphs I ever found in the literature. We've dressed it up a little bit with animals, but this is in essence an important way to think about how the Serengeti works. What Tony and Simon Mduma and Justin Brashears did is over a number of years, every time they came across a carcass, they figured out sort of cause of death, sort of CSI Serengeti, okay? And then they try to figure out, okay, is it predation or not? And then they plotted this for various species in the Serengeti. So let's start here in the upper left. The oribi is about a 20 kilogram grazer. Look at this. Look at this, 100% mortality due to predation. Sorry, kids, but what do you imagine oribi parents tell their young, right? Someday, you're going to be a meal, okay? And it's not just the cats. It can be jackals, it could be wild dogs, it can be large snakes, it can be large raptors. There's a lot of ways to die in the Serengeti, okay? He says with a smile. Impala, bigger animal, still taken down pretty much by predators. Topi, still bigger, taken down by predators. Now let's move down here to the right. Elephant, zip. Hippopotamus, essentially zero. Rhinoceros, zero. Maybe giraffe a little bit, happens occasionally. But really, statistically, an insignificant amount of predation of these animals. Well, look at what they've got going on here. These animals, 100 kilograms or less. Elephant, up to several thousand kilograms. These are really large. I think what this sort of underscores are two strategies going on in the Serengeti. Old movie fans, I'm going to refer to this way. This is sort of the James Dean live fast, die young lifestyle up here, okay? You got to reproduce quickly, okay? And pretty short lifespan, lots of predation. Elephant is kind of using the Marlon Brando all-you-can-eat strategy, okay? Which is you just get as big as you can and you're too big for predators to take down. Now, of course, to be an elephant, you need a lot of resources. So you're not going to have large population numbers, right? You need a lot of food, a lot of space, a lot of water, okay? Here, much less so, but nonetheless, you're an easy meal. So it's these two sort of extremes underlying, and some animals are sort of in the middle. Zebra, fair amount of predation, some control from food. Buffalo, less so by predation, more controlled by food. So really, these animals are controlled by the availability of food, these animals by predation, and some a bit of a mixture of the two. And really, it's wildebeest from long-term studies, almost 40 years of study by Tony Sinclair and Simon Mduma, are regulated by the availability of food. Now, think about how that might work. How could the availability of food, it's intuitive, but how might that really work in controlling the size of a population? And what I want you to think about is sort of picture the density of animals out on the Serengeti, maybe in the early days when there were fewer wildebeest, and then as the numbers got bigger. In the early days, when they were at low density, they experienced high growth. Well, think about the amount of food. Growth is high when the amount of food available per capita is high, right? Big grassland, salad bars open. They got plenty of food to eat, all the individual wildebeest. But as that grassland fills up with wildebeest, and especially as you get towards the dry season, where the amount of food and the amount of nutritious food is way down, population gets stressed. At high density, you see the populations actually come down. And in fact, in drought, Tony in some years saw 30% mortality among the wildebeest. So the availability of food on the grassland is determining what that grassland can support in terms of migrating wildebeest. And it's just hovering around about 1 million, given the normal fluctuations in the climate. Now, the reason why I tell you about this, about how this relationship with food, is that it's already our third Serengeti rule. And that is that's the regulation of some species. Remember, we want to understand the numbers of these different creatures out on the Serengeti depends upon their density. This was not discovered first in the Serengeti. It works this way in lots of other places, but you can see it at work in the Serengeti for animals that are food regulated, like elephants, buffalo, wildebeest. Okay. So why have I told you all this? I've told you all this because basically every place is a Serengeti. Later this spring, your backyard with its rose bushes and aphids and ladybugs, that's a Serengeti. Anywhere where you've got basically plants with the bottom of the food chain, something grazing on those plants and something eating those grazers, sets up these situations where you could have a keystone species, a trophic cascade working through the system, and density-dependent regulation. So our job as biologists is to figure out, for various species or in various places, how does the system work, right? What are the rules of regulation? And if we're going to intervene in any of these systems, we need, just like we need to know in the human body, who are the important players. Identify the key players that regulate community structure, figure out the rules that govern their play, and consider replacing what is missing or fixing broken links in these ecosystems. Can we really do it? All right, can we sort of take a medical approach to wilderness? And I'm going to finish tonight with two stories. One familiar, perhaps familiar, one probably not familiar to you. I'm going to go to first to the place that a lot of people refer to as the American Serengeti, Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone and lots of parts of the American West are known for an iconic tree, the aspen tree. But botanists working in and around Yellowstone had noticed over the decades that something weird was going on with Yellowstone's aspen. When they looked at the age of aspen in Yellowstone, they noticed that most aspen were really old. There were very few young trees. And this is a plot of the age of those trees over almost 2 centuries. And what you can see is most trees are fairly old, and what you really have missing is young trees. Why were there not new aspen growing up in Yellowstone for really the past 40 or 50 years or 70 years? Okay, so what could be it? So this is another detective story that various biologists worked on. But here's a picture of Bill Ripple out in the field giving you a little bit of hint of what's going on. Because all those marks on those aspen trees you're looking at are caused by elk browsing. You can see them chewing off the bark, and it goes pretty high up the tree. So the question is this due to excessive elk browsing? And if that's the case, in other words, that the elk are just hammering the young trees before they can get started, why would that be going on? Well, think again about our little food chain. If elk are feeding on the aspen, oh, don't hit. Crazy thumb. Kids, did you see that in time? Professor's giveaway. Nobody saw that, right? And this totally ruined my audition for a quiz show once. No. Giving away the answers. Okay. All right, so pretend you didn't see that. What might be missing in Yellowstone? Predators, right. Any predator in particular come to mind? All right, you all advance to the next round. But here's the important thing. It turns out, in the campaign to pretty much eradicate wolves from the lower 48, we know that the last wolf was eliminated from Yellowstone in 1924, which is an uncanny coincidence to when we see those trees really not doing well and young trees not growing up in the aspen. So after 20 years of debate, but largely driven by the Endangered Species Act, which required the federal government to do something about restoring or protecting endangered species, in 1995, the first wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone. Some of you may know about this. And the question is, what happened? And think about that for a second. It was a relatively small number of wolves. They'd been missing from Yellowstone for 70 years. So what would we have the right to expect, right? The system had been working for 70 years without them. Now you put some wolves back in there. What might happen? You know, nothing. They might just die off. Exactly. They might not adapt whatsoever. Maybe something bad would happen. Who knows? And there were like 200,000 public comments about this reintroduction. Okay, there was a lot of opposition, but there was a lot of passionate people in favor of it. So it happened. Okay, so this reintroduction has been watched very carefully. So what happened? Well, the number of wolves after the reintroduction has sort of oscillated, through the years. This is counting wolves just inside the Yellowstone Park proper. But over that time, the elk populations have declined by about 2/3. Okay? But at the same time, when you look at things like aspen and you look at the browsing levels on their trees, the level of browsing has really gone down and the aspen height has really come up. And this was detectable really within 5 to maybe, let's say, 10 years, maybe after a decade after reintroduction. Let's think about that time scale. I didn't really leave that as an option in my quiz, which is maybe nothing would happen, but maybe, how long would you have to wait for something to happen? They've been missing for 70 years. But now 2 decades later, 2.5 decades later, we can really see that something's going on. And some things went on that no one expected. These are some pictures taken from the same position, same place in Yellowstone before wolf reintroduction and after. And what you see growing in the foreground is willow. And willow, it's given away by the slide. Willow is the favorite food and building material of? All right, and who doesn't? Michigan loves beavers, right? There's a lot of beavers in this state, aren't there? Isn't there a beaver island? Yeah, all right, well, there you go. You know your beavers, okay. And more beavers becoming established in Yellowstone, more willow. As it turns out, more cottonwood trees, more shade in the streams, cooler streams, less erosion of the stream beds. So these even effects on the hydrology of Yellowstone, just 2 decades in. So that brings me to my 4th Serengeti rule, and the most important one for take home, and I'm going to drill it home with one more story. And that is, I think, much to biologists, somewhat to biologists' surprise, and very much to our satisfaction, nature is resilient. After a 70-year absence, things can come back. Given a chance, habitat, protection, some time, populations can rebound dramatically. I'm going to mention a few examples and then go for kind of the home run. We have some experience of protecting species even before the Endangered Species Act. Northern elephant seal, sea otter both came under protection in the early part of the 20th century. Northern elephant seal, we think, was battered down to as few as 20 individuals. They're back to about 200,000. Otters taken down to about 1,000 along the Pacific Rim, now over 100,000. You can see about a 12-fold recovery in northern Pacific humpback. You know the bald eagle story, so that's a 20-fold recovery or so over roughly 40 to 50 years. And of course, the gray wolf, after reintroduction, has spread out over the whole Yellowstone ecosystem. So when individual species are protected, we know that they can come back in numbers. And in the case of the wolves in Yellowstone, bring that predator back, and dramatic things can happen on the landscape with plants, et cetera. The reintroduction of the wolf introduced a trophic cascade. By its feeding on elk, it had these effects on plants, cascading through the ecosystem. But what if more than one species is missing? What if it's not just one species like this or the wolves that are missing? In fact, we know from the paleontological record that wolves were the only mammal missing from the Yellowstone system from before human settlement of North America. Right? So that wolves have been selectively eliminated, but everything else that had been in Yellowstone for a long time was still in Yellowstone. But what if more than one species is missing? Can we really do anything about that? What if a lot of species are missing? Okay? Be a much tougher situation. That doesn't stop some people from trying. So I'm going to close on a story from Mozambique in southeastern Africa. Tell you about a park called Gorongosa. Gorongosa is in about the geographic center of Mozambique. Mozambique is a country about twice the area of the state of California. Huge coastline along the Indian Ocean. Gorongosa, a different kind of place than the Serengeti. It has a huge lake at its center that swells in the wet season and shrinks a bit in the dry season. But that's a magnet for wildlife. And in the early 1960s, Gorongosa was a crown jewel and a destination for jet setters like Hollywood stars like John Wayne, et cetera, that wanted to see big game. And this is what it looked like. I wish I had a soundtrack for you, but this is 1963 Gorongosa. You can see the little VW vans going through there into Gorongosa and people checking out the wildlife. You can see the lions are so well fed that they're just playing in front of the wildebeest. The symbol of Gorongosa was a lion. There are about 500 lions in Gorongosa. And you may notice I'm using the past tense. And the reason why I'm using the past tense is that in the mid-1970s, after independence from Portugal, one of the worst civil wars in modern times erupted in Mozambique. 1 million people were killed. 5 million people were made homeless. And unfortunately, Gorongosa was sort of the center of rebel activities and the site of a lot of fighting. I'll show you right here in this film clip. Sorry, whatever that was. So you can see some park buildings there out of the corner of your eye. So after 20 years, almost 20 years of civil war, when biologists who had been studying Gorongosa before the war came back, you know, what they found was a place that was completely shot to pieces. And they drove. All the park buildings were bombed out. All the cars were, all the vehicles, of course, were shot up. And they conducted a wildlife survey. And they compared that with the numbers they had seen before the war. And here's their results. So before the war in blue and after the war in orange. 14,000 buffalo down to about 50. 2,500 elephant down to about 100. 3,500 hippo down to about 50. I think you get the picture. They couldn't find a lion. People tell me driving around Gorongosa in the year 2000 that you'd be lucky in several hours to see a baboon or a warthog. And that's pretty much the way Gorongosa would be today if it weren't for an American philanthropist named Greg Carr, who learned a bit about Mozambique, and he'd actually done very well in the telecom industry in the 1990s with something called voicemail. But he was really keenly interested in both human development and conservation. And when he heard about the Gorongosa story and understood sort of the plight of Mozambique after the Civil War, and realized that Mozambique was the only country in southern Africa without a safari industry, he thought, well, maybe if we bring back Gorongosa, we can bring back jobs, we can bring back the wildlife, we can bring back a big important piece of Mozambique. So he signed a development agreement with the government of Mozambique, a public-private partnership between Greg's Foundation and the government of Mozambique in 2004. And in 2015, Greg invited me to come see Gorongosa for myself. So this is the last handheld camera work by Fellini here. And I'll just give you a little sense of what Gorongosa looks like. Sorry, there's a little helicopter background for ambience there. So we're flying over the lake at the center of Gorongosa. As that lake shrinks, it leaves behind this really fertile, silty soil that gives rise to all these plants. You can see some animals in the foreground. We're going to fly up to some of the little rivers and rivulets coming in and out of the lake and look at and see what we can find. So you're seeing a little bit of wildlife there. You're seeing some birds, and you're probably getting a little bit airsick. But here we are coming up to this. Anybody can figure out what those animals are right there? Bingo, good spot. This is, if you've not been to Africa, this is a good distance to be from that many hippos because the smell is unbelievable. But the animals, of course, are magnificent. And you can see some of the hippos are not wanting to be filmed, and they start swimming away. And we're going to set the helicopter down in a second, and we're going to go a little bit inland to a water hole, see what else we can see. And here we go, we'll set that down. Okay. And notice all the youngsters in this group. This is what we saw with the elephants across Gorongosa. Lots and lots of moms with babies. Okay, so it just so happened the week that I was there was when the scientists presented their data from a survey they completed of wildlife in Gorongosa as of 2014. So let me update you in the course of this project. How have the large animal populations changed? Well, in 2000, the data I showed you, if you added up all the large animals in that bar chart, there were fewer than 1,000 large animals of all types combined. And by 2014, there were 71,000. So they're not all in the same proportions they were before, because some populations have been decimated further and some populations are coming back much faster. But there's a lot more elephants and a lot more hippo and a lot more buffalo and a lot more antelope and amazingly a lot more water buck. But a lot has changed in Gorongosa. And there's about 67 lions as of 2014. There's a larger number today, I'm happy to say. But, as I said, they're not all in the same proportion. In fact, so lions are fewer, as I said, about 67. And I would have said to you, no hyena, no leopard, no wild dog, except for one day in 2016, Greg sent me this picture from a camera trap in Gorongosa. That's the first leopard seen in Gorongosa in 40 years. And more have been spotted. Okay. Yeah, just checking. Okay. Now, you may ask, so they have done some reintroductions. And the most recent reintroduction, if you're interested in it, were wild dogs or painted wolves, whichever way you want to call them. And they're doing marvelously. But mostly, those numbers I'm telling you about are all recovery from the populations that were already there or some immigration coming in from the outside, because Gorongosa is connected to some other unsettled wilderness in Mozambique. But the turnaround of Gorongosa's fortune has become a matter of great pride to Mozambicans. The current and previous president of Mozambique have been tremendous champions of the project. I'm told that if you visit the president of Mozambique, you're going to be handed a video about Gorongosa. And Greg wouldn't be telling you this story about wildlife. He'd be telling you about the people of Gorongosa, because much more has been spent on human development than on wildlife to create schools, healthcare, girls' clubs, maternity programs, farming programs for the roughly 200,000 people that live on the edges surrounding Gorongosa. And so that's really changed the vision for the future of Gorongosa. It's a huge park. It really helps to have a helicopter to get across it. And it also includes a rainforest-covered mountain, Mount Gorongosa. But the vision now is to create a large conservation area, mixed use, a couple 100,000 people living in it, which is both for the wildlife and for people, allowing farming, a little bit of logging, et cetera. There were some hunting concessions in the outside of Gorongosa, one of which is already converted to national park. And the vision is to now connect the whole system all the way to the Zambezi River into the Indian Ocean. And when that's done, as I'm implying here, that will be an area as large as the Serengeti. About eightfold from where it is now, about 30,000 square kilometers. The Serengeti Conservation Area also incorporates Ngorongoro, if you know that part of Tanzania. It's a massive, massive area. And the projection is that this area would have the carrying capacity for up to about 10,000 elephants and 500 lions. And this is the vision. The president of Mozambique has committed to a new 30-year agreement with the Carr Foundation. And if you ask Greg Carr how he's going to spend the rest of his life, this is what he's going to do. So I hope you find that a story of hope. But now, if you have been reading the newspapers, you know that Mozambique is facing a tremendous challenge. So I just, at least for factualness, I got to tell you that, a cyclone hit Mozambique last month. Much of the inland area was inundated because a lot of it is below sea level. Well, Greg and his several hundred staff of Gorongosa took the lead to be the cyclone relief effort for the whole Gorongosa community, the 200,000 people around Gorongosa. They brought in military planes, helicopters, et cetera, full of food. They did first a lot of high water rescues, bringing in food, bringing in medicine, vaccines against cholera, et cetera. This is an ongoing effort. I'm not trying to drill up anything, but when I talk to people about what's going on in Mozambique, people ask, what can they do? And if you go to gorongosa.org, it'll tell you something that you can do. And in a country like Mozambique, a little bit of help goes a long way. So if you're inclined, go ahead and help them out. But what I'm proud to say is that it is the Gorongosa team that organized this relief effort, 200 plus park rangers, all of the park staff, all of the educators, et cetera, that are active in Gorongosa, and they're fighting to bring back the housing and things that are around Gorongosa. The wildlife has evidently done pretty well. They got to high ground, but there's been a lot of flooding in the communities around Gorongosa. A lot of them were built in floodplains. So this kind of work has challenges. They're hopefully rising to the challenge. Let me just close by going back to the Serengeti, and let me tell you the fate of that highway they wanted to put through the Serengeti. Well, I can tell you I have it on very good authority from 3 confidential sources that all the roads through the Serengeti remain unpaved. And for goodness sake, let's keep it that way. Thanks for listening. Did you want me to take any comments or questions that people might have? Do you want to just shout them out, or you want Mike? You guys can shout out. You're from Michigan, my God. 100,000 people at a football game. I think you can shout. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you speculate now about the problem of invasive species?
Yeah. So invasive species. To my knowledge, in Gorongosa, the main invasives are plants that kind of took over when the herbivores were knocked down. And as it turns out right now, it's not too worrisome because the water buck, which are there in large numbers, are hitting on the invasives. So it seems like these invasives, to some degree, are edible. In terms of invasive animals, nothing I can really, I don't think there's any issue with anything invasive. In fact, what's really coming back is like bird diversity. There's somewhere near 400 species that have been recorded in Gorongosa. Gorongosa, some folks are thinking this may be the most biodiverse area in all of Africa because all sorts of biomes exist in Gorongosa. It's a much more heterogeneous landscape than a place like the Serengeti. So bird counts look good, reptiles and amphibians look good. The larger mammals in uneven numbers, but things are happening. So the major invasives I'm aware of are plants, but the grazers seem to be hitting those. So I'm not aware of anything that they think is an existential threat that's an invasive. You sound like you had a follow-up question.
In general, though, it seems like between climate change and invasive
Yes, those are two of them. It's, yeah, so climate change. Well, here you go. A cyclone, which they think is maybe one of the most severe that's hit southern Africa in a long time, if not perhaps in recorded history. Of course, people think severity of these storms are a consequence of the warming of the oceans. So Mozambique's going to get hit by more cyclones. So what's going to happen there? Well, they probably need to change where the resettlement happens of people here, so they're not in these flood zones that are going to get inundated. Climate change is going to have a heterogeneous effect. Some places are going to get wetter and some places are going to get drier. For Gorongosa itself, I can't give you the prediction. They've had drought years and they've of course been inundated in other years. In terms of invasives, and you mean this in general, of course invasives are an issue in lots of places, and there are experts in this room who could say more. I'm going to just take a lead from your question and say, okay, so there's some problems. Did we give up when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? No, sorry, that's an Animal House line for all you youngsters, never mind.
So the question is, do we continue to try to intervene, and we just sort of take a hands-off approach?
Well, I got to say, in some ways, the major intervention from Gorongosa, other than, for example, bringing back some predators. So now, after a number of years of really monitoring the lions, they brought in painted wolves. We also know them as wild dogs. So that's an intervention. A lot of the rest is just simply preventing poaching. So it's really just enforcement that snares are not taking all these sorts of animals. And so they're understanding that a place like Gorongosa is going to reach sort of a new equilibrium, whatever that is. And other than bringing back some predators actively, because they were so depleted, so few in number, I think they're going to let a lot of this run its course. In the Serengeti, most things are there that have been there historically, except for rhinos, which are poached to such small numbers that they've been relocated for their safety. So, I mean, other people can chime in here, but I think there's a sense that some of these large wildernesses have a shot. And they have a shot even perhaps by keeping our hands off, particularly keeping harvesting, away from these places. But they don't have a shot, Greg would tell you, if the people living in and around these parks don't find them to be an asset to their lives. Hence the farming programs, healthcare, or for example, helping rebuild communities after disasters. So it's really important that these parks are seen as an asset and taken over their management. So most of the management of Gorongosa are Mozambicans. Most of the management of the protected, well, virtually all the management of the protected areas in Mozambique are Mozambicans. So that's the other stage, which is, Westerners are going to have to go home and leave the management of these places to the people that own them. Part of getting there, after 20 years of pretty much a interruption in education and everything else that was going on in Mozambique, is to help bring back science capacity in Mozambique. And I'm happy to say that, to my knowledge, the only master's program in conservation biology in a national park in the world is one that my organization's funding in Gorongosa. And that's all Mozambican students. So I got no crystal ball, but I think we only got two choices, which is do our best. And I think some of this is going to be letting these systems reach a new equilibrium. But great questions. Appreciate that. Let me just make sure okay. I feel I'm overbalanced to this side of the room, but go ahead now, fire away. Yeah.
So just a quick comment on my understanding is the wolf story in Yellowstone.
Mm-hmm.
That one of the consequences was that of taking the wolves out there was it actually ended up changing the course of a river there.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the grazing and whatever, and that over the course of years and then reintroducing them, it actually recovered.
Yeah, it's a little, the wolf story is complicated, so let me tell you my best understanding from the people I'm in touch with. So yes, when you lost a lot of that vegetation along the stream bed, you get more erosion, more soil goes in, and it does sort of change the hydrology of the system. Now that you have the wolves, and actually the bears are doing a number on the elk too. So it's a more complicated situation because some other changes have taken place in Yellowstone, and the bears are really hitting the elk calves, and the bears don't have some of the trout they used to have. It's complicated. But nonetheless, the recovery of vegetation along the stream beds is stabilizing those stream beds, and actually more cover is also giving you a little cooler water, which is better for trout and other sort of fish. But you're not going to change some of these fundamental things that happened in the last 70 years about the direction of some of these streams. You're just kind of really stabilizing them from further change from where they are. So it's been a little romanticized, I would say, in terms of just how much reversal of the course of rivers wolves can do. But it's stabilizing the stream edges has really helped a lot, is my understanding. You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious, are there studies on the large animals for the non-park sections of Africa?
Of Africa, of Gorongosa. Yeah, so for example, I could say for Gorongosa is that part of the thinking about how to put together a larger wilderness is surveying these other places that are not national park yet and figuring out what's in there and how they might, what impact they might have by joining them together. So there is a fair amount of work outside the park to figure that out. I can also tell you in places like Kenya that about 65%, a number I heard last week in a presentation, about 65% of the animals that are, of the wildlife that are not in government-run national parks are on community-held lands, and actually a relatively small number, really small amount of community-held lands in Kenya. And a number of those communities have banded together to form something called the Northern Rangelands Trust. And on these, it's about 7% of Kenyan lands. Since 2012, poaching has dropped by 97% on those lands. So this is community conservation, but 7% of Kenya's land area being managed by a consortium of communities, and that includes doing their own law enforcement with respect to poaching. And these animals they're not in national parks. This is not national park. This is community held land. There's livestock around, et cetera. But it's been a really good development for the wildlife. So there's lots of new models or new things being explored, relative to just sort of, keep people out sort of approach that involves either communities, say in Kenya, or just better planning and better understanding of how various areas will interact in the migration routes of animals, for example. So did that give you some sense that people are paying attention to the animals that are outside the protected areas?
I did a project in Tanzania about 50 years ago, and the area where I studied, the population now increased 3.5 times. And I can't imagine...
The human population.
Human population.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that does not have an extraordinary disruptive effect.
There's no doubt. I mean, the population boom, Kenya's population, I think, has gone up 6-fold since independence in 1960 or so. There's no doubt less room for all this wildlife, that's for sure. But in those places that still exist today, there's active measures being taken to try to stabilize things at where we are now and perhaps, for numbers to come back. But, human populations needs agricultural land, needs livestock, grazing land, et cetera. And the question is how are those conflicts going to be managed? And out of the northern rangelands of Kenya, it looks fairly promising that the two can be managed to some degree. But certainly, there's a certain level of population load where obviously it's, certain wildlife is not going to be able to thrive whatsoever. Yeah. Look, the number of lions has probably dropped by 95% in a half century across Africa. So there's no doubt that populations of various things have plummeted. The question is, can we stabilize them or even nudge them back a little bit in the other direction? It's getting a little more depressed in here, but you're drawing statistics out of me. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was thinking about the scenarios that, thank you for a wonderful presentation, by the way. The scenarios that you've depicted are of a landscape that's remaining, but the animals have disappeared. But in lots of places where there's large, high biodiversity, the landscape has disappeared. The forests have disappeared. So yours is more of the silent forest syndrome, and but there's other places where the forests have just disappeared, and the species are going because their
habitat loss. We know that's fundamental. Yeah.
So there's some efforts to do reforestation. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, if you have some experience or.
The questions about reforestation. There are probably people in the room who know better. I know along the Brazilian coast, a lot of reforestation. Certainly, even in Kenya, as people started understanding they were losing their watersheds, the whole movement started by Wangari Maathai. It was pretty fantastic. It's planted large numbers of trees. So I think there's an understanding in various parts of the world about the benefits of reforestation, which also includes, if we were to just reforest a good amount of the rainforest that we've cut down that's now not usable land. My understanding from people who know far better than I, that the effect of reforesting that we could probably pull significant tens of parts per million of carbon out of the atmosphere. So the benefit of reforestation it's win-win-win. First of all, in some parts of the world, it's jobs. Other parts, it's also perhaps better organized lumber system. Thirdly, pulling out carbon. And fourth, it could be habitat. So yeah, reforestation would be one of the cheaper things that we could possibly do, and that would involve communities. And it's being done in various places. In terms of large animals, I can't really give you any stories there, because really as forests become fragmented and habitat becomes lost, the larger animals are the first things that are lost, because they need bigger ranges and more resources. So I can't give you any story that comes into mind of reforestation really bringing back large animals. I mean, there's certainly some stories like out of Costa Rica where some forests have been restored over decades, and it's been great for flora and fauna, but nothing on the scale that I just described that I'm aware of. Other people in the room may be. And I also want to mention one other thing while we're on this, as you think about this. The thing, like the Gorongosa project I just told you, annual budget for all the wildlife work, all the rangers, education, healthcare, schools, farming. Take a guess, shout it out. Okay, you win the Price is Right, but it's actually higher than that. We wish. It's $6 million. It's $6 million. But here's the point. Oh my God, how can we not afford to spend this kind of money, right? $6 million, right? Relative to the wealth in the world, this is a joke, right? So this is large-scale restoration going on, hundreds of jobs being created, lots of the farming job. There's 4,000 Gorongosans farming coffee on the mountain. How can we afford not to do this? So the other thing I just want to make in terms of judging, to what degree we might be successful here, trying costs nothing, So let's do it. It's a drop in the bucket relative to how we spend our money on other things. So thank you for that editorial. Go ahead.
I was just going to add on to your comment about working with the local population. I worked on a project with the community in Kenya, trying to discover the best fencing to keep the elephants and the elands away from the maize, so that the farmers were going to be more successful. And it included using beehives, and then teaching the farmers how to become beekeepers and making use of the products of the bees. So that activity was helping to keep the elephants from being poached.
That's right. Thank you for that. The management of wildlife, of conflict with wildlife, is really important. It goes on in Gorongosa. Well, elephants do the same thing. They go in and they eat the maize in the field. Beehive fences have been constructed. Of course, lions are a significant concern in some places, particularly in southern Tanzania. But if humans are going to live near wildlife, if not among it, these situations have to be managed, and it's really a local control issue. Westerners cannot come in and say how this is going to be done. They can sort of offer some possibilities, but it's really for the local communities to decide, or it just won't stick. Anything from this side of the room? I feel like I've ignored all of you yeah. Henry, no questions? He knows better. Okay. Henry Chung, one of the other alumni from my lab, who made the trip from, the school at Michigan State? Is that right? Okay. That's right. Oh, come on, take it easy on them. They're still recovering from the basketball. Yeah. Go green. Yeah. All right, you think we're all caught up?
I'll try one.
Sure.
Okay. So when you were talking about Yellowstone, and you mentioned that the wolf, when it was removed, was more or less had been there and represented the local predators. But we've got a whole bunch of paleontologists here in the audience, and in their heads they were probably thinking about the fauna. And you mentioned human settlement. When humans actually settled the continent, and with all these mega mammals that have gone, right?
Yeah.
And which looked very like the Serengeti. Okay, that would have been probably a
Yeah.
paleo landscape
Yeah.
common to this continent. So, could you comment on the fad about rewilding?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple things. Let me take it there. So the data, as I understand it, for the paleontology community, comes from Liz Hadley. To my knowledge, did the primary work in Yellowstone, which was especially to use remains found in caves and things like that to take an inventory of what we thought the biodiversity was of mammal populations in Yellowstone and to understand how far that went back. Now, of course, when you get back into Ice Age mammals and things, let's just deal for the last 10,000 years, let's say. And the only thing missing was the wolf. But this is just a qualitative count. Of course, we know that bison populations were much larger than they are today because there were 60 million bison in the American West, which were almost annihilated. It was actually, is my understanding, the remnant population from Yellowstone that was used to rebuild the bison population. So qualitatively, the wolves complete the set, but quantitatively, we can't tell that with historical data in terms of the relative numbers of things. The rewilding idea is that could we restore large tracts of the American West by connecting large landscapes with each other and providing habitat, if not some directed efforts in breeding, for example, larger numbers of bison. So there is this American Prairie Restoration Project whose ambition, I can't tell you the hundreds of thousands to millions of acres they have in mind, but there is an idea that maybe my grandkids will see a lot more animals in the American West than they see today. And the rewilding idea is just that, which is to reclaim some of the habitat and for especially large connected habitat for the big grazers and the big predators. So is that what you want to do with the rewilding? And then, of course, there's like things like the Yellowstone to Yukon project, the Y2Y project, the understanding that large animals like wolf, elk, bear, roam far, their home ranges are much bigger than these national parks. And when that's realized and discovered, the question is, how can you give them more room to roam? And so the Yellowstone to Yukon project is to create a whole lot of connection all the way from Yellowstone up to the Yukon, public lands, private lands, and then to use things like overpasses and underpasses. It's amazing. There's like 106 overpasses or underpasses across Highway 93. I've seen the footage myself of bears and everything else and mountain lions using them to create more continuity of habitat there. So there's some pretty large-scale imagination going on of creating more contiguous habitat with much larger populations than exist today and allowing the existing populations much more room to roam. So we can be hopeful about that.
Okay, I think we're going to have to give our speaker a rest. This is his second talk today. Please join me in thanking him.
Thanks a lot. Happy to stick around for any one-on-ones. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks especially to the students. I'd finish with a Go Blue, but I was at Wisconsin 31 years, so good luck.